my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Father Jacob Strand, sometimes called the Quite Reverend. Quite very Reverend. Many of you know him, or most of you probably know him, but for those of you who don't, Father Jacob is a priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, ordained in 2012. Currently, he's the pastor of St. Francis Cabrini and St. Mary's Immaculate Conception in West Bend. Father Jacob is a scholar. He earned a licentiate and a doctorate in sacred theology from the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and the Family at the Lateran University in Rome. He also serves on the Milwaukee Archdiocesan Bioethics and Health Committee, which advises the Archbishop. This morning, Father Jacob will illuminate us on the Catholic Church's teaching on love and life. His talk is entitled, "And the Two Shall Become One Flesh, the Inseparable Meanings of Conjugal Love." Please welcome Father Jacob Strand.
Thank you, Dr. Little, for that introduction. Dr. Smith told me I have 45 minutes this morning, and we're going to need every minute of it. So I hope you're all ready. We're going to begin by talking about some foundational theological principles. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the history of both contraception and in vitro fertilization. Then we're going to talk about some current debates, and I'll end by making an appeal to all of you, members of the Medical Guild here in Milwaukee. I'm very grateful that you all came this morning. At the outset, I have to just acknowledge that it's rather ironic that you all came to hear a talk about marital intimacy given by a celibate priest, right? It's a little bit ironic, but what it shows is that you all intuit that philosophy, divine revelation, and the magisterium have something important to say about this. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. At the outset, I also just want to offer a brief disclaimer. I realize that the topic of today's talk is deeply sensitive. Some of you perhaps have struggled for a long time to accept what the Catholic Church teaches about all this. Maybe for some of you, you've accepted it, but you see it more as a burden than a liberation. And perhaps for others, it's all just very hurtful because it doesn't resonate with your experience. So I just want to acknowledge all that and the sensitivity of this topic and beg you to try to approach it with an open mind and an open heart. I think we can all agree that the world today is deeply confused about marriage and sexuality. And this confusion has hurt many, leaving them deeply wounded. The Catholic Church's teaching is the answer to all this. So you would think that we would talk about it every chance we got. But more often than not, we don't. We shy away from it. Perhaps because of widespread dissent, perhaps because of moral relativism, perhaps because of the sensitive nature of this topic. When it comes to God's plan for conjugal love, members of the Church are more often than not silent. Go back 10 years. Remember when the Little Sisters of the Poor were fighting the contraceptive mandate that was a part of the Affordable Health Care Act? When this story dominated the headlines, we rarely heard anything about contraception itself, even when church leaders were speaking to their own people. Rather, what we heard a lot about was religious liberty. Now, there was an obvious reason for this. It was religious liberty that mattered in the courts, and we were fighting the battle in the courts. However, the swiftness of the pivot away from contraceptives to religious liberty, to me at least, spoke very loudly. This was an opportunity to explain God's plan for conjugal love. It was an opportunity to affirm the Church's pro-life teaching with regard to contraception, but nobody wanted to touch it. If we consider the matter of assisted reproductive technologies, such as in vitro, the situation is not much different. Again, we're dealing with a highly sensitive topic. There are few things in the world as heartbreaking as a couple who desires to have a child but is unable to have one. Furthermore, there are millions of people in this country today who were conceived through in vitro. And so the church's teaching could be misinterpreted as posing an existential threat to a parent or a child. Because of all this, we rarely talk about it. And because we rarely talk about it, people are very ignorant. Just this past summer, IVF made the headlines when President Donald Trump surprised America by promising an IVF mandate if he were elected. Now, we haven't heard anything about it since, but he promised that last summer. When EWTN reporter Raymond Arroyo asked Trump about the possibility of a Catholic exemption, he was very favorable to the idea, but he was also clearly surprised why Catholics would ever want an exemption. His ignorance here reflects the general opinion. Why would anyone deny a child to those who desire to have one? In addition, given the serious ramifications of unsustainable birth rates in Western countries, people are acknowledging now, isn't IVF a way to be pro-child? People don't know about IVF because we are reluctant to talk about it. But this morning we will break the silence. The topic merits a 2-semester course, but we'll see what we can do in 45 minutes. As Goethe said, be bold and mighty forces will come to your aid. So let's see what we can do. Where shall we begin? How about with God? Every Sunday at Mass we profess our faith. I believe in one God, Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. God creates things visible and invisible. All too often we focus only on the visible things: dogs, plants, the sun, our human bodies. What about the invisible things? God also creates these: angels, the soul, our intellect and will, and the very pattern and order of creation. The created order has an interior form and finality, an invisible structure, if you will. We could call it the meaning of creation. Now, there are some times in our lives when this meaning really impresses itself upon us. For example, when you are overwhelmed by a beautiful symphony, the brilliance of the score, the talent of the musicians combine to produce an experience that truly moves your heart. Such experiences lead us to intuit that there is much more to creation than meets the eye. The music is so profound and universally appreciated because it's leveraging an objective hidden form, structure, or pattern. Such an order is also present within the human person and our actions. We see this on full display in the love between a husband and wife. Sometimes we call this nuptial love. Nuptial coming from nubis, which means clouds. There is something otherworldly about this kind of love. By their promises, bride and groom participate in an order that precedes them and also is beyond them. We could call it the Creator's plan. When we sense it, we are arrested by its beauty. And this is why people cry at weddings. What is the meaning of this nuptial love? To answer this big question, we'll assume Aristotelian metaphysics, and we'll search for its purpose. The assumption here is that knowing what it is for will tell us something about what it is. So, what is conjugal love for? Let's begin our search in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. The first chapter of the book of Genesis provides us with an orderly view of creation. Remember, at the end of the 6th day, God creates the human person, body and soul, in his image, and in 2 different ways, male and female. This sexual difference is followed immediately by a divine command: be fertile and multiply. The second chapter of Genesis gives us a different creation story. This story presents man's longing for a suitable partner. He doesn't find that suitable partner among the animals. But then God puts him to sleep, takes up a rib, and forms woman. And when the man sees the woman, he rejoices that unlike the animals, she is like him. The author of the sacred text exclaims, "This is why a man leaves his father and clings to his wife, and the 2 shall become one flesh."
So if we put these two accounts of creation side by side, we can see that the sexual difference is ordered toward both procreation and the unity of the spouses. It's about life and love. Men and women are like other animals insofar as they generate new life, but because they are made in the imago Dei, the image of God, they do so in a way that differs from the animals. Their coming together is also for the sake of their union. Perhaps this is why it is frontal, face-to-face, something we don't see in the animal kingdom. One could argue that the fruitfulness and fidelity of marriage is really the paradigm of the entire Bible. In the Old Testament, the prophets looked to marriage to describe God's love for his chosen people. And in the New Testament, Christ elevates marriage as a sacrament and then describes himself as the bridegroom who loves the church, his bride, to the very end. And notice, this love of Christ is fruitful, for it opens the wellspring of grace. Many of the church fathers clearly articulated the purpose of marriage and the marital act. For example, St. John Chrysostom and St. Augustine affirm procreation as the end or good of marriage, but they also point to another purpose, which is the chaste and faithful union of the couple. The medievals built upon this foundation, and they arranged these ends hierarchically. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas referred to the procreation and education of offspring as the primary end, and the mutual service that spouses render one another as the secondary end. Pope Leo XIII's encyclical letter, little known, but he did write an encyclical letter on marriage, and also the 1917 Code of Canon Law reflect this hierarchical arrangement. So from this brief survey, we can see that marriage unites a man and woman in a permanent faithful bond, and this faithful bond is the very foundation of working with God to generate new life, which makes spouses into parents. Before the 20th century, just about everybody intuited all this. And because they intuited it, most people disapproved of actions that would stymie the procreative trajectory of the conjugal act. Look, for thousands of years, there have been primitive forms of contraception. And, as long as we're in the nitty-gritty, there's always been the possibility of withdrawal, right? The sin of onin. But most people, and certainly all Christians, were united in their disapproval of these actions. This was because the societal consensus was that God creates things for a purpose. And when dealing with moral acts that engage the soul, it's wrong to interfere with that purpose. For example, Martin Luther and John Calvin both issued damning critiques of onin. This was because they believed that marriage was naturally ordered toward procreation. And this is what all Christians thought, whether they were Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox. This position, which now is very controversial, was then also reflected in civil law. In 1837, for example, the Comstock Act in New York made it illegal to transport obscene materials, which was interpreted very widely to include anything that would help procure an abortion or anything that would contracept the conjugal act. Other states adopted similar laws, and none of this was controversial. It wasn't until the 20th century, as the first wave of the women's rights movement gained steam, that the societal consensus slowly began to dissolve. In 1917, Margaret Sanger published the Birth Control Review. 4 years later, she began the American Birth Control League, which would evolve into Planned Parenthood. The tide was changing. The 1930 Lambeth Conference of Anglican Bishops was the first time that contraceptives were approved by a Christian denomination. In a very carefully worded statement, the Anglican bishops permitted married couples to use contraceptives in a very limited fashion. But the door was cracked, and in short order, it would swing wide open. Now, without wasting a moment, Pius XI responded to the Lambeth decision with an encyclical letter called Casti Connubii. In this letter, he articulated the Creator's plan for conjugal love, and he condemned contraceptives, arguing that they frustrate the order of nature. After Casti Connubii, the long line was drawn. Protestants were generally told they could use contraceptives under various circumstances, while Catholics were told that if they had a serious reason or a grave reason to do so, they could use the rhythm method. In the mid-20th century, the contraception debate became much more complex because of the development of the hormonal birth control pill. Interestingly, a Catholic gynecologist named Dr. John Rock pioneered this research. Dr. Rock was a very faithful Catholic. He was actually a daily communicant, so he had to defend his work. And he defended his work as an attempt to help couples live a more natural life of sexual intimacy without being excessively worried all the time about getting pregnant. Dr. Rock listened to many married couples every day, and he discerned that they were just preoccupied about being pregnant. And so he thought that really made their marriage very unnatural, and he wanted to help them out of it. In 1960, the FDA approved the drug Innovid, which would afterwards simply be called the pill. And the world would literally never be the same. In 1965, the Supreme Court ruled state laws banning contraceptives unconstitutional because of the right to privacy. By 1968, over 1 million American women were already on the pill, contributing significantly to the massive cultural revolution sweeping the West. The pill went from being tabooed to being a standard part of women's health care within only a decade. Very soon, the Catholic Church was standing alone. Many hoped the Second Vatican Council would change church teaching, but the Council Fathers punted on the topic. Rather, they decided that a commission would be established, which would make a recommendation to the Pope, who would pass judgment on the issue. The commission met for several years before forwarding 2 reports to the Pope, the majority report and the minority report. 90% of the members of that commission signed off on the majority report, which gave the green light to contraceptives so long as married couples still showed a general openness to children. Now, as you may have learned from studying some history, this report was leaked to the press in 1967, so you can imagine how well that went. After the leak, just about everyone expected that Pope Paul VI would reverse the teaching of Pius XI. But then, on July 25th, 1968, as the Pope was packing his bags to spend Ferragosto at Castel Gandolfo, Humanae Vitae dropped. And for the Pope, it would not be a very relaxing vacation. In the encyclical, the Pope calls married couples to responsible parenthood, which demands that they respect how God has wisely ordered the laws of nature. To observe such laws, the Pope teaches that each and every marital act must of necessity retain its intrinsic relation to procreation of human life. Now, why must each act be connected to procreation? The Pope explains that this teaching is based on the inseparable connection established by God, which man on his own initiative may not break, between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent to the marriage act. Now, to say these significances or purposes are inseparable is quite simply to say you cannot have one without the other. Without openness to life, love would be self-centered and frustrated, and without a loving union, new life would simply be a mechanical production, not the fruit of human love. It's worth noting that while Humanae Vitae excludes any action specifically intended to prevent procreation, it does permit couples to make recourse to infertile periods when they have discerned well-grounded reasons. In Latin, it's juste causae, just causes, for doing so. Such couples, the Pope argues, still work with the Creator's plan rather than choosing to act against it. Their intention might be to avoid pregnancy, but their well-grounded reasons for spacing births preserves the integrity of their intention. The Pope concludes this encyclical letter with a series of appeals to public authorities, scientists, doctors, and married couples. He also appeals quite strongly to priests, reminding them of their duty of obedience to the magisterium. What was the response? Disobedience. For example, the day after Humanae Vitae was published, Father Charles Curran and his colleagues at the Catholic University of America wasted no time in taking out a full-page ad in the New York Times to express their dissent. They told Catholics they did not need to abide by the teaching of the encyclical. Within months, Curran recruited almost 700 moral theologians around the world to sign a letter dissenting from the encyclical. It's really quite shocking when you think about it. In the immediate aftermath of the publication of Humanae Vitae, most dissenting pastors reminded Catholics of their duty to follow their conscience. Others explained that the encyclical was not infallible, so it was fallible. But this really only distracted from the true linchpin of Pope Paul VI's argument, namely the inseparability of the significances of the marriage act. While some have ignored this principle of inseparability, I find that those who think with the Church have found it very helpful. It is a simple and clear way to address this topic. It also lends itself to a more personalistic understanding of procreation as something tied to the love of husband and wife. For these reasons, using this language has become a standard part of the Catholic response to the question of contraception. But that's not all. The principle is also employed in a context beyond anything Paul VI ever imagined when he published Humanae Vitae, specifically to address assisted reproductive technologies. It is to these technologies, specifically in vitro fertilization, that we will now turn. So as I already mentioned, primitive forms of contraception have been around for a long time. But these modern reproductive technologies have only been made possible by 20th century scientific developments. A little history here. In 1959, the first animal, a rabbit, was born after being conceived in vitro, literally in the glass of a test tube or a petri dish. In 1978, the first human baby, the first test tube baby, was born. Baby Louise Brown was born 9 months after her mother's egg was fertilized by her father's sperm outside the reproductive system before being transferred back to her mother's womb. Assisted reproductive technology would develop significantly in the 1980s with the ability to freeze embryos, thaw them years later, and successfully transplant them into their mother or a surrogate. Despite being very expensive, IVF continues to grow in popularity. Today, over 2% of children born in this country are conceived by in vitro fertilization. The Catholic magisterial response to all this dropped in 1987 when the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, led by Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, published Donum Vitae. The instruction considered the moral questions raised by these new reproductive technologies. It specifically focused on in vitro fertilization and intrauterine insemination, IUI. And it also focused on these within marriage, primarily. So, cut to the chase. What did the CDF say? Well, the instruction said that these technologies could not be permitted. Why? The primary reason is because of the inseparable meanings of conjugal love. Donum Vitae references Humanae Vitae and teaches that whereas contraception deprives the conjugal act of its openness to procreation, IVF, in seeking procreation, which is not the fruit of a specific act of conjugal union, objectively affects an analogous separation between the meanings of marriage. At face value, contraception and in vitro couldn't be more different. One seeks to limit births, the other seeks to increase them. However, the crux of both Humanae Vitae and Donum Vitae is the exact same principle, namely the inseparability of the procreative and unitive ends of the conjugal act. But why? Why must these meanings of marriage be united? Why is it not acceptable for spouses in a permanent loving marriage to view procreation as the end of their marriage in general and not the end of each marital act? If spouses are sometimes able to enter into the marital embrace seeking procreation, why are they not permitted at other times to seek to deepen their union while excluding procreation? Or why can we not understand fruitfulness as a quality of conjugal love in general without hyper-analyzing each and every act? Some theologians, such as the famed moral theologian from the Catholic University of Louvain named Joseph Selling, believe there is no reason at all. Selling argues the inseparability principle has no place in the tradition and that we should all reject it. For example, he points to the 1917 Code of Canon Law, which affirmed the primary and secondary ends of marriage. Selling observes the code did not specify anything inseparable about the two ends. How about the Second Vatican Council? Again, Selling observes nothing even resembling the inseparable meanings of sexual intercourse. He concludes that this omission was not surprising, since no such idea had ever been put forth in the official teaching of the Church. It's quite a statement. He goes on to teach his baffled readers that Paul VI introduced this idea and surprisingly few noticed. He effectively argues that the Pope pulled a fast one on all of us, and that it's high time that we admit it. Because there is nothing inseparable about these two ends, theologians who dissent from Humanae Vitae argue the spouses can seek the unitive end without the procreative. Such theologians refer to this perspective as a personalistic approach. Father Charles Curran, remember him, the dissenter, explains that such an approach focuses attention upon the unity of the two persons, husband and wife, and what is best for their relationship. He argues sometimes what is best for their personal relationship is to exclude the procreative purpose. As such, he claims one could interfere with the physical sexual act for the good of the person or the good of the marital relationship. Curran believes that impeding the procreative purpose sometimes benefits the unitive, and thus it is permitted. What about frustrating the procreative purpose? Curran brushes aside such scrupulosity as the product of physicalism or biologism. These labels describe an excessive preoccupation with the physical structure of an act. The logic is as follows. The physical act of sexual intercourse produces offspring. This is God's plan. Ergo, frustrating this plan or purpose is immoral. But Curran believes that such reductive, impersonal reasoning is just utterly unconvincing. Selling and Curran agree that the inseparable principle is a sham. It's time for the Church to admit it and move on. Only then will the Church be able to address other burning questions. Perhaps Curran says it best when he declares, Humanae Vitae today is the dike holding back the waters of change. At this point, it behooves us to ask, if Paul VI really did introduce this concept, where did he get such an unfounded and revolutionary idea? Both Selling and Curran point their fingers at a Polish cardinal, friendly with Paul VI, named Karol Wojtyła. So are Selling's accusations justified? What is the origin of this inseparability principle, which has become so widespread? Did Wojtyła really make it up to defend the Church's teaching in a world on the brink of the sexual revolution? Was Paul VI guilty of adding a foreign concept to the magisterium? Are the dissenters from Humanae Vitae finally vindicated? Have the Catholic spouses who respected this teaching toiled in vain? Furthermore, given the CDF's instruction, Donum Vitae, is that also null? Was the church wrong to prohibit the use of in vitro fertilization? Is the door finally open to using IVF and IUI to alleviate the pain of infertility? Before answering those questions, we must admit that Paul VI did introduce the phrase inseparable significances into the church's magisterium. Furthermore, it is quite likely that this phrase originated from Karol Wojtyła. Cardinal Wojtyła's very own Diocesan Birth Control Commission and his book, Love and Responsibility, reference the phrase. But all that is immaterial. What we need to know is whether or not this phrase accurately describes reality. That is to say, is the phrase true? Are the ends inseparable, or are they not? A close read of Humanae Vitae reveals that Paul VI was careful to justify his use of the inseparability principle. He says it derives from the fundamental nature of the marriage act, which is inherently unitive and procreative. And this is because of laws written into the actual nature of man and woman. So if this is true, then it would behoove all of us to investigate said laws of anthropology. Aristotle taught that the human person is a hylomorphic unity of matter and form, and the Bible agrees. In the second creation account, we read that the Lord formed the man from the dust of the ground and then blew into his nostrils the breath of life. The dust of the ground corresponds to our physical body, which is similar to the lower creatures, and that breath of life blown into us corresponds to our spiritual soul, which animates the body and endows man with intellect and will. These two, body and soul, are absolutely inseparable. Referencing the Council of Vienne, the Catechism says it this way: the unity of soul and body is so profound that one has to consider the soul to be the very form of the body. The soul gives life to the body and is entirely present in every part of the body. St. Thomas Aquinas puts it this way: the soul is present in the body, not as being contained by it, but as containing it. Think about that one for a while. According to this biblical Aristotelian Thomistic account, man is not a body with a soul or a soul with a body, but he is a human person. Truly, corpore et anima unus, one in body and soul. This anthropology was universally accepted in the West until the 17th century. The philosopher who challenged it more than anyone was a man named René Descartes. One evening, Descartes locked himself into a little cabin away from everyone else and away from the rest of the world. And he began a series of intellectual meditations through which he systematically doubted all experiences that he sensed through his body. In so doing, he effectively drove a wedge between his interiority and his exteriority, between his mind and the world, between his soul and the body. He concluded the only thing he could know for sure was his mind. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. As for the body, it was eviscerated of all inherent meaning. Cartesian dualism would become the foundational anthropology of modernity. The mind is what matters, the body is merely an accessory, without a priori meaning, that can be dominated by the mind and will. Descartes famously declared men to be the masters and possessors of their nature. So long as our intentions are good, we can do with the body really whatever we please. We see so many ways this is playing out today. While Selling and Curran would formally reject Cartesian dualism, we can detect traces of it in their arguments. For them, the mind and affectivity are what truly matter. So if spouses need to stifle the body's procreative potential to express their love, then they have every right to do so. In this way, Professors Curran and Selling can coherently argue that certain circumstances justify the use of artificial contraceptives. But if the Aristotelian biblical Thomistic anthropology is right, if the human person really is a unity of body and soul, and furthermore, if this whole person acts in the exchange of lovemaking, then we cannot silence the body so easily. We must listen to it speak, and the body bespeaks life. With this anthropological corrective in place, we can respond to the critique that Humanae Vitae demonstrates the weakness of biologism or physicalism. This critique follows upon the body being sundered from the soul and subsequently treated merely as biological matter. When the body is viewed according to its inseparable union with the soul, then we must acknowledge that the body reveals not only biological matter, not only biological data, but rather something about the nature of the conjugal act. Spouses are obligated to maintain an openness to children in every act of intimacy, not merely to avoid the frustration of a physical or biological process, but rather to preserve the ontology of the conjugal act, which is ordained by God to express spousal love both in its procreative and unitive dimensions. Few taught these truths more impactfully than Karol Wojtyła, the same man accused of creating the principle of inseparability ex nihilo. And it was this man who was elevated to the chair of Peter in 1978. From there, he not only defended himself, but more importantly, he defended the truth of married love. Whereas the personalistic philosophers who descended from Humanae Vitae limited themselves to subjective human experience and affectivity, Pope John Paul II took seriously the rich meaning of the body as well. He taught that the body is not merely the seat of physical processes, but rather a constitutive dimension of the human person. And it has the dignity of expressing or manifesting the fullness of the human person. This truth is essential to understanding the personalism of John Paul II. John Paul II shows how this happens by drawing an analogy with language. The sexual difference could be likened to the grammar of a language. By respecting this grammar, spouses can speak the language of loving self-gift through their bodily exchange of persons. But in order to speak words that are through this mutual exchange, their actions must correspond to the conjugal meaning of their bodies. He concludes that a lack of correspondence would be tantamount to speaking a lie. Perhaps this connection between conjugal love and the body is best displayed at a wedding. Through their formal exchange of promises, bride and groom give and receive one another. But this exchange, ratified by spoken words, also needs to be consummated through their bodies. And for this mutual self-gift to be total, it also must include the couple's fertility and procreative potential, which is proper to their bodies. This really just makes sense. When you really love someone, you don't only give them your soul, you give them your body. As Jacques Maritain wrote, "He who loves a human person with mad, boundless love gives himself to this person in his body and in his soul." This is true of the monk who loves God by denying his body earthly pleasures. It's true of the missionary of charity who loves the suffering by entering into their pain. It's true of the mother who loves her child by giving the milk of her breast. And it's true for spouses who give their bodies not merely to exchange rights, not merely to derive pleasure, not merely to remedy their concupiscence, but rather to manifest their love, which is always and everywhere unitive and procreative. At this point, it should be clear that Paul VI's decision to employ the Wojtyłan inseparability principle was justified and helpful. This contribution does not pretend to add anything new to the deposit of faith. It merely makes explicit what was previously implicit, namely, the procreative and unitive purposes of marriage and the marital act are inseparable because the body and soul of the human person are inseparable. More often than not, when Catholics defend church teaching against contraception and IVF, they quite understandably appeal to arguments that all people of goodwill could understand. For example, they might consider eugenics. One cannot ignore that racial eugenics was a catalyst for the research of modern contraceptives. Others may seek to instill fear by describing how assisted reproductive technology could lead to a genetically favorable trait selection process that would decide which embryos live and which die. Catholics may also point to the killing of innocent life. Some forms of the pill have an abortifacient fail-safe side effect. Meanwhile, the process of IVF yields more frozen embryos than desired, which are frozen and then more often than not killed. Safety and health are also important arguments. Chemical contraceptives produce a laundry list of chilling side effects. Furthermore, they're not green, and people today like green things. Or Catholics may choose to enter the rights conversation, arguing that children have a right to be born of their biological parents. Or maybe they will simply note the observable and undesirable consequences of a society that gives total approval to contraceptives, such as encouraging fornication, adultery, and a loss of respect for women. These arguments all carry a certain persuasion in the right context, and I think we should be deft in using them. But they have significant weaknesses. For example, just because a technology has a shameful history doesn't mean it couldn't be used for good today. And with advances in medical technology, undesirable side effects will certainly be reduced. And arguing based upon rights typically leaves interlocutors stuck in the logjam of competing rights. Notwithstanding the value of the aforementioned arguments, they all leave much to be desired. They don't get to the heart of the matter. My appeal to all of you today is to investigate the nature of reality itself, to investigate being itself. We must search for a deeper metaphysical perspective of reality. Such a perspective will ask questions like, what is the ontological structure of the marriage act? And what is conjugal love for? These questions ask about the fundamental structure of reality. Discerning this structure is essential for providing a moral response to the ever-changing and complex questions about sexuality and human reproduction that we face today. To think this way, we must first overcome reductive philosophies. I think we can all agree that the field of medicine is deeply influenced by scientism. Scientism limits knowledge to the empirical. As such, it rejects truths that cannot be observed through the microscope. Things like form and finality are treated as meaningless. At the same time, medicine is burdened by the technological imperative. This demands that we do anything we are capable of doing, especially if it mitigates suffering. This imperative fuels the drive for progress, which bulldozes through soft concepts like morality. For Catholic medical professionals to truly seek the good of their patients and also please the Creator God, they must jettison the constraints of scientism. They must resist the never-ending demands of the technological imperative. Only in this way will they become equipped to judge increasingly complex questions with a deeper perspective. This perspective firstly appreciates the full truth of the human person, whose actions are ordered toward God or ordered by God toward their proper ends. Conjugal love has a meaning, which we understand according to its God-given purpose. This is not crusty scholasticism. This is not wishful thinking. This is not even a matter of faith. It's a truth of nature. Nature understood not merely as the biological, but as the ontological. By its ontological structure, the conjugal act is the type of human action that is both procreative and unitive. Secondly, this metaphysical perspective appreciates the person as a unity of body and soul. The persons who exchange themselves in the unbreakable bond of marriage are not two minds who share affection, but rather they are two hylomorphic unities of body and soul. They share the entirety of their persons. Just as the person is an inseparable unity, so too are the ends of the conjugal act. The questions surrounding procreation will become ever more complex. Will healthcare companies still provide coverage to large families that refuse contraceptives and sterilizations? Will it become normative to choose babies with preferable genetics? Because of sperm donors and surrogates, will we get to a point when some children will not be able to answer the questions, who is my mother and who is my father? Catholic physicians who want to think with the Church are realizing more and more that the constrained laboratory perspective will not suffice. We need deeper resources. As forms of birth control continue to develop, as assisted reproductive technologies propose ever new and sometimes frightening possibilities, and as Catholics are increasingly pressured to accept all this, it is incumbent upon Catholic medical professionals to have a robust understanding of God's plan for married love. While there are plenty of superficial responses to the questions of the day, the heavy lifting will always be done by the metaphysical understanding of the person and the conjugal act. Just as body and soul are inseparable, so too are the procreative and unitive meanings of the marriage act. This perspective will guide physicians as they seek to propose the beauty of God's plan for married love in an ever-changing world. As such, I would like to argue today that for Catholic medical professionals to be good physicians, they must first be good metaphysicians. Thank you. Please repeat the 90% majority report opinion in 1967 was rejected by the Pope, resulting in the rejection of birth control methods for Catholics. Yeah, so the majority opinion, so what happened is after the Second Vatican Council produced Gaudium et Spes, which called for a papal commission to study these questions of birth control, utility, and also to look at the question of the population of the world. There was a very small commission established, which mostly had priests on it. I think we're looking at 6 to 10 people on that initial commission. Paul VI then expanded it and also diversified it. So then you had not only priests, but you also had married couples on it. There was a very famous married couple from the States, Pat and Patricia Crowley. They were German, no kidding. They were Irish, obviously. Pat and Patricia Crowley. They were one of the couples on the commission. They also had a number of doctors and scientists as well. So the majority report was signed by 90%, but it was very clear that the Pope is the one who would pass judgment. So he was not simply going to take the opinion of the majority report. The minority report supported Pius XI's teaching in Casti Connubii. There was also a little-known minority report that came from Krakow in Poland. Cardinal Wojtyła was not able to come to that session because the Soviets wouldn't let him out. But he sent his own minority report anyway. If there is great confusion about marriage today, what is the role of Cardinal Burke's new book, Consensual Incapacity to Marry, which correctly teaches that all American tribunals have been incorrect in giving fake annulments for the past 50 years? Okay, so I have not read His Eminence's book on the consensual incapacity to marry, but it looks like Cardinal Burke is supporting the opinion that most people are able to consent to marriage. It's not that difficult to consent to marriage because the constitutive elements of marriage are present in the order of nature. Marriage is a unique sacrament. It's not only in the supernatural order, it's also in the natural order. So Cardinal Burke would support the opinion that most people, through understanding of the natural law, know what it means to consent to a marriage. It's not that hard. And because of that, these are unbreakable bonds. And so he would disagree with so many marriages being declared null after a tribunal process. So that's the argument there. And I would say that most canon lawyers today are spending a lot of time looking at the reasons that are given for declaring marriages null, and they will continue to do so. But I haven't read Cardinal Burke's book. If Pope Paul VI did not issue Humanae Vitae as infallible dogma, then what are the spiritual consequences for Catholics if they disregard it? Okay, so the question of the infallibility of Humanae Vitae depends largely on what sort of magisterial teaching the encyclical letter actually is, and thus what sort of assent corresponds to the level of teaching of the encyclical letter. Regardless of its magisterial status, I tried to argue today that we can argue for the teaching in Humanae Vitae, even without the magisterial weight given to the document. With regard to the spiritual consequences for Catholics if they disregard it, we should do all we can to assent in mind and soul to the teachings of the Holy Father. So even if it's not infallible, it seems that based upon its good reasoning and natural law, it still would behoove every Catholic to assent to it. Just leave it at that. For years, I've tried to bring up Pope St. Leo XIII, the great important teaching promulgated on December 30th, 1880. Thank you for reading Arcanum Divinae Sapientiae, which no one reads. 41 states, the Church never ceases to endeavor to bring the couple back to full reconciliation. How can we get American tribunals to stop giving more about the fake annulments? Okay. Well, at this point, I think we just have to trust that if a diocesan tribunal commissioned by a successor of the apostles declares that these marriages are null, we have to trust that it's accurate. We could spend our entire lives questioning every annulment that is given, and that's not going to really lead us anywhere. So, should the question be researched? Of course. Should these criteria for declaring marriages null be re-examined? Of course. However, I don't think it's helpful at all spiritually to go into the past and then to question every annulment that is given. Can you give advice for responding to the moral reasons that justify the use of NFP? Okay, so this is a good question. Many look at using an artificial contraceptive or using natural family planning as being very, very similar, if not the same, with regard to their moral category, because both are trying to avoid pregnancy. This topic has been addressed a lot by the magisterium, going all the way back to the mid-19th century. So in the 19th century, what we found is that much more research was being done on the woman's menstrual cycle. This allowed for doctors to understand the fertile and infertile windows much, much better. As people started to pick up on this, they started to kind of use their own rhythm method. Well, some people felt bad about doing this, so they started to confess this more. There was a diocese in France where the bishop had heard from his priest that so many are confessing this, they don't know if it's a sin or not. So that bishop of Amiens in France wrote to the Apostolic Penitentiary and said, should we disturb couples who continue to confess that they are trying to have intercourse only during infertile windows? And the response from the penitentiary in 1853, I believe, was, do not disturb them. Okay, the penitentiary was asked again in the 1880s. Again, the exact same response. Pius XII, in his letter to midwives in the 1950s, addresses this topic, and he talks about couples using the infertile periods for grave reasons, and then Paul VI in Humanae Vitae talks about just or serious reasons. Why is it different? Paul VI actually addresses why it's different in Humanae Vitae, so you can read the text. He talks first about the act itself. One, that is, the couple who might be using NFP is performing an integral conjugal act. It is a man and a woman who are coming together to consummate their married love. They have not done anything to sterilize that act. The other is introducing something into the act which changes the very object of the act itself. It's now not an act of a normal conjugal love, it is a contraceptive act. So in these two cases, we're talking about two different acts. The question, though, is about the intention. It seems that they have a very similar intention. Pius XII and Paul VI believe that the reasons that are given for having intercourse during the infertile periods preserve the integrity of the intention. So you could look at it in terms of like a virtual intention and actual intention. These couples that are performing the normal marriage act still have the virtual intention to perform the conjugal act, which is unitive and open to life. The couples who are using a contraceptive, right, they have changed their actual intention to make it actually a contraceptive act. So there's a difference here that we're trying to spell out between them. That being said, a couple using NFP certainly could be morally culpable, right, for an intention that's not fully open to procreation. And that is why we talk about abuse of natural family planning is something that needs to be avoided. Yes.
Along those lines, there are several questions on whether it is okay for married couples to have relations if they, for some medical reason or age, are infertile, and then is it okay or not for them to have, or what should they do if they, through some fault of their own, for past acts like tubal ligations or vasectomies, can they still have, or can they, having repented, have?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So infertile because of age or because of like a sterilization, tubal ligation or a vasectomy, can you still perform the marriage act? With regard to like something like a vasectomy, it is encouraged to look at the possibility of trying to reverse it. However, someone is not required to do so with teaching at present. That is an action of the past. The action that you're making in the present is trying to perform an act of conjugal love. So you're not doing anything to that act. Right? You've done something in the past, and I realize that when Paul VI talks about this, he talks about actions before, during, or after as being against God's plan. But if that sin has been confessed, then we have to say that somebody can continue performing the marriage act. Very good question. One more.
Yeah. Another question was about IVF. How would you respond to a friend telling them they're doing IVF? What is your responsibility to share the church's teaching?
Yeah, if you have a good friendship with the person, that is the best avenue to help explain something to someone. We know that people oftentimes don't want to hear things from someone that they cannot trust loves them. So if you have a good friendship with the person, I think you're probably the best person to try to explain this teaching to them. And I would think what's first important is to acknowledge the difficulty that they find themselves in, how absolutely heartbreaking this is, but to look at other options. And obviously adoption is one of those options, which is a very noble thing. Oh, do you have any more?
I have some more.
Okay.
Well, there's a group of questions or several complimentary things. Great talk. Can you come to my church, KFC, my school, Wisconsin? And how can priests be encouraged to preach and teach it like this talk?
Okay. Yes, happy to talk about it any time because I already accused the church of not talking about it enough. So my money where my mouth is, I have to do that. And then how can we encourage priests to speak about it? I think just to trust that most of the time the audiences that we priests have are people of goodwill who do deep down desire to know the truth, and we need to speak into that. So that requires a great sensitivity. It requires like a certain desire to understand people's experience and to listen to them and hear them out. But like with those things in place, I think we need to preach anything that we believe is good for people, right? Like if we believe something is good and leads to one's flourishing, then it's incumbent upon us to speak about it. I will say though that I think the best forum is the forum where the audience can ask questions and where there is an exchange. I'm not saying we should not preach about it, because I think preaching about it is important. That's where we hit most people. However, it's usually, in my experience, more fruitful to be able to sit down at a table with someone and have a discussion about it, or to discuss it in a small group.
Well, there's a question on valid reasons for NFB or for postponing.
Yeah, so
Policy
Policy 6 gives reasons for making recourse to national family planning. He talks about reasons within the marriage and family and external reasons as well. So within the couple's life could be the physical or mental health of either of the spouses. External reasons could be sociological or even economic. Discerning this, when to use NFP, is something that many are talking about today. So you can go online and you can hear very different perspectives of this question. One that I recently came upon that I thought was very good was somebody who proposed a second inseparability principle. We've talked a lot about the first inseparability principle, which is the unit of procreative meanings of the conjugal act. This second inseparability principle is with regard to the primary end of marriage, the procreation and education of offspring being the two parts of that end. And the argument was that if you cannot educate more children, and education there should be interpreted broadly, if you cannot care for more children, okay, well that's going to be a justified reason then for having intercourse only in infertile times. Because you don't want to bring children into the world and then not be able to care for them. So it's a very simple principle, but I thought that that was helpful. Interestingly, in Humanae Vitae, Paul VI begins by just talking about how much the world has changed. And I think this needs to be considered as well. For example, years ago, families used to stay more together, and so you bring more children into the world. You have relatives and grandparents who can help care for those children. The cost of living was also a lot less. The world has drastically changed. And so I think when we look at Catholic families, we're like, well, they don't have as many kids as they used to, so they must have a contraceptive mentality when they're using NFP. I think we need to be a little more careful about throwing those stones, making that accusation, because the world has greatly changed. Also, what's interesting to note is that Pope Paul VI, Saint Pope Paul VI, encouraged doctors and scientists to study the menstrual cycle more so that we can know more about it. And many people today, such as the Paul VI Institute down in Omaha or the St. Philip Institute, many have done that. In the Archdiocese, they're doing that as well. I promised the director of our office here, Tori Frankie, that I would let everybody know that we have booklets that they've recently published on natural family planning. They're actually doing a lot to expose the church's teaching about natural family planning. which is not only something that can be used to space out births, but also can be used to understand your body better. And this is why Tori and her colleagues are doing all they can to teach with young women especially about their body, because it's going to help them understand how they were created by God much better. Others also speak about natural family planning as being a vital sign of your overall health. So the more we can know about the menstrual cycle, the more we can know about our overall health. So there are other reasons for using it as well, apart from spacing births. Yes, one more question.
I know that you were embarrassed about one thing that you talked about, but one thing that I was really impressed was the idea that we might be able to baptize embryos. Is there like a path that I feel like if we could get to that, and we actually could do that, that would be a kind way also of shedding light on what's really happening with IVF and bringing the humanness and whatever to the embryos. So I mean, and plus, you know, what's going to happen to these little babies. And then the other thing, though, which is another sticky thing, is, and my daughter is a natural family planning specialist, a family practitioner, so I know she's dealing with all these things too. But another thing, when we talk about, when we're trying to justify, though, contraception and to say, look, do we have enough money or whatever, the problem when we do those things, though, is then it brings in all these other things, like it does bring in more like, oh, it's okay. I mean, I know we're not saying it's okay to abort, and a lot of the contraception are abortifacients and stuff, but we have to put a little bit more trust in God still. And we never know, even if we think that we're at a financial wonderful place or we're able to educate our children, anything can happen where, you know, the mother dies the next day and now the father's got to do all the educating, or the father loses a job and you're not gonna, you know, so.
Yeah, I mean, and
right.
clearly I mentioned how like the standard of living has increased so much. Do we have to go along with that?
Right.
Right? Like
Right.
maybe Christians are called to live differently. Maybe part of that means a radical openness and a greater generosity to God, even though that's going to have some financial consequences. So I think we always want to err on the side of being generous with God. Yeah, and place trust in God. No, that's true. Yeah, I mean, because this is the problem with the contraceptive mentality, is you're taking this same mentality that other couples have who would be using illicit means of spacing births, and then you are using them simply in a way that does not frustrate the order of nature. Okay, well, there's still something wrong there, and we need to be converted, right, away from such selfishness, and toward greater generosity to God. That's certainly true, and I think we should encourage couples in that way. I also just think we need to be careful about not throwing accusations at couples who perhaps don't have as many children as you think they maybe should.
Beautiful presentation. For me, I have to admit that in my career, I was not fulfilling necessarily the church's teachings for a number of years until I really came to a tape, which was Contraception, Why Not? And that was kind of changed things, and then learning about the theology of the body and so forth. So it's not a small undertaking for you to do this in 45 minutes, and beautifully done. And Father also remembers that we probably spent a couple of hours talking about the topic and the sensitiveness of it and so forth, and 45 minutes and so forth. So thank you so much for accomplishing that. There was also, we had a guild event about 15 years ago. We had Father Ted Holmchick from the NCBC came and talked to us about stem cell research at that time. And he was talking about, these hundreds of thousands of embryos that are frozen, and even when they're being used to be implanted, you thaw them and some of them die and so forth. There's so many different aspects of what's going on here. At that time, he said the same thing. The church hasn't made a decision. His opinion at that time was, my best advice is if you have those, that you keep paying the lab to keep them frozen until the church sorts it out. So it was a difficult question from the outset. So thank you, Dan, so much. So thank you, everyone, for coming. We will be sending out requests for your survey response. Also, please take an envelope for the Zeal to the Lord's House campaign. If you have an opportunity, please be sure and take a rack card. We'd love to see you at our next event. And if you know a place where you can post some of these flyers, when you leave, you'll see some flyers on the table, so don't hesitate to take those. So thank you again.